two people can sit down and try to visualize the exact same goal, use the exact same words, close their eyes for the exact same amount of time, and walk away with completely different results. One of them will swear visualization changed their life. The other will quietly conclude that this whole idea is nonsense invented for people who like feeling good about themselves without doing any real work. And here is the uncomfortable truth neither of them usually realizes. The difference was never whether visualization works. The difference was how they were doing it. Because most people who try visualization are doing it in a way that was almost guaranteed to fail from the very first attempt, and nobody ever explained to them why. José Silva has spent years studying exactly this gap, watching some people transform their behavior, their confidence, even the direction of their entire lives through mental imagery, while other people, using what looked like the same basic idea, felt absolutely nothing. He became convinced and eventually demonstrated repeatedly through direct observation that visualization is not one single technique. It is closer to a skill with very specific mechanics, and most people who casually try it are skipping almost every mechanic that actually matters, then wondering why closing their eyes and picturing something nice accomplished absolutely nothing. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what those mechanics are, the specific ingredients that separate visualization, that quietly reshapes how your brain responds to your own life from visualization that is nothing more than a pleasant daydream that evaporates the moment you open your eyes again. This is not going to be another generic reminder to picture your goals and feel positive about them. We are going into the actual internal process, step by step, the same process Silva refined over years of direct observation, until it became reliable enough that ordinary people with no special background at all could use it deliberately and expect it to actually change something. Let's start with the mistake almost everyone makes first, because understanding the mistake is what makes the correct version make sense. Most people, when told to visualize their goals, picture a single static image, like a photograph, themselves holding a diploma, themselves standing in a new house, themselves shaking hands after closing a deal, a flat, frozen picture held in the mind for a few seconds, often accompanied by a vague, generic feeling of things are going to work out. And then nothing happens. No shift in behavior, no shift in confidence. The image fades, the day continues exactly as it always has, and the person quietly files visualization under things that sound nice but do not actually work. Silva discovered something crucial about why this specific approach fails so consistently, and it comes down to how your brain actually processes imagined experience versus real experience. A flat, static image, disconnected from sound, physical sensation, and specific detail, simply does not register strongly enough in the parts of your brain responsible for shifting behavior and belief. Your mind treats it the way it treats a passing thought, noticed briefly and then discarded, no different from noticing a stray thought about what to have for dinner. For visualization to actually influence anything, it has to be built in a completely different way, one that your brain cannot easily distinguish from an actual memory. This is the central idea underneath everything Silva taught about mental imagery, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it explains everything that follows. Your brain does not have a perfectly separate filing system for real memories and vividly imagined scenes. Both get processed through overlapping neural pathways. This is exactly why a sufficiently vivid nightmare can leave your heart racing even after you wake up and realize none of it actually happened. Your body responded to the imagined scene as though it were real, because on a physiological level it largely was. Silva's core insight was recognizing that if imagination vivid enough can produce a real physiological fear response, the same principle could deliberately be used in the opposite direction to produce real confidence, real calm, real familiarity with situations that have not happened yet, provided the visualization was built with enough of the right ingredients. So what are those ingredients? Let's go through them one at a time, because this is where the actual technique lives. And skipping any single one of these is exactly what turns visualization from something that reshapes your mind into something that simply passes the time. The first ingredient is multisensory detail, and this is the single most commonly skipped piece of the entire process. Most people visualize almost exclusively in pictures because sight is the sense we default to most easily. But a scene built only from visual information is thin, and thin scenes do not stick. Silva taught people to deliberately build in the other senses, one at a time, until the scene felt layered and full rather than flat. What sounds exist in this scene? Not vague background noise, but specific sounds, a particular voice, a particular kind of music, the specific hum of a room. What does the air feel like against your skin in this moment? Warm, cool, still, moving. Is there a smell present? And what is it specifically? What physical sensation exists in your own body? The weight of something you are holding, the texture of a surface beneath your hand, the specific way your own posture feels as you stand or sit in this imagined moment. Each additional sense you deliberately add is not decoration. It is another neural pathway being activated, another piece of evidence your brain uses to treat this scene as something closer to a genuine experience rather than an abstract thought. The second ingredient is specificity of people and dialogue, and this is where most visualization advice online falls painfully short because it stays vague on purpose, offering generic phrases anyone could apply to any goal. Silva taught the opposite. Vague scenes produce vague results. If another person appears in your visualization, you name them specifically in your own mind. You picture their actual face, their actual way of standing, their actual voice, not an actor playing them in a movie version of your life, but the real person, exactly as they actually look and sound. If words are being exchanged, you construct the actual words in a way that genuinely sounds like how that person speaks, not a generic line you might expect to hear in a film. This precision matters enormously because a generic, borrowed scene feels like fiction to your mind. A specific, personal scene populated with real people speaking in their real voices feels like something closer to a memory that simply has not happened in physical time yet. The third ingredient, and this is the one Silva considered absolutely non-negotiable, is emotional engagement matched precisely to the outcome, not performed, not forced, but genuinely felt in the moment of visualizing. This does not mean working yourself into an artificial state of excitement. It means allowing yourself to actually feel, even briefly, the specific emotion that would naturally accompany that achieved outcome. Relief, quiet satisfaction, pride that does not need to announce itself. The specific feeling of tension finally releasing from your shoulders. Silva discovered that visualization performed with flat, disconnected emotion, essentially reciting a scene to yourself without actually feeling anything while doing it, produces dramatically weaker results than visualization where the emotion, even a modest, quiet version of it, is genuinely present during the exercise. This is because emotion appears to function as a kind of amplifier, signaling to the deeper, non-verbal parts of your mind that this particular scene matters, that it is significant, that it deserves to be remembered and referenced later, the same way emotionally significant real memories tend to stick with far more clarity than emotionally neutral ones. Let's pause here and address something important, because this next distinction is exactly where people who have tried visualization before and gotten inconsistent results usually went wrong without realizing it. There is a critical difference between forcing emotion and allowing emotion, and Silva was extremely precise about which one actually works. Forcing emotion looks like gritting your mental teeth and trying to manufacture excitement through sheer effort, almost performing enthusiasm for an audience of nobody. This tends to keep you locked in an alert, effortful, analytical state, the exact opposite of the relaxed receptivity that makes visualization effective in the first place. Allowing emotion looks completely different. It means building the scene with enough sensory and specific detail that the appropriate feeling arises naturally, on its own, the way a genuinely moving piece of music or a well-told story can produce real emotion in you without any conscious effort required to feel it. If you find yourself trying hard to feel excited during a visualization, that effort itself is usually a sign the scene has not yet been built with enough specific sensory detail, because when the details are right, the feeling tends to show up uninvited, quietly, on its own. Now let's talk about the fourth ingredient, and this one connects directly to something we have covered in other explorations of Silva's broader method, but it deserves specific attention here because of how much it amplifies everything else. Timing and mental state matter enormously. Visualization, performed during a fully alert, busy, analytical state of mind, squeezed into 2 rushed minutes during a hectic afternoon, produces measurably weaker results than the exact same visualization performed during a relaxed, slightly drowsy state, particularly the state that occurs naturally right before sleep. This is not because the content of the visualization changes. It is because your critical, comparing mind, the part of you that constantly measures imagined scenes against current reality and quietly whispers, "This isn't actually true," is far more active and vigilant during a busy, alert state than during a relaxed, drowsy one. The exact same scene, built with identical detail, simply meets less resistance when your mind is already calm and receptive. This is why Silva consistently taught people to reserve their most important, most detailed visualization work for the few minutes before falling asleep after deliberately relaxing the body and slowing the breath, rather than trying to squeeze meaningful visualization into a stressed, rushed moment during a busy day. The technique itself does not change. The conditions surrounding it change everything about how effectively it lands. Let's talk now about something Silva discovered almost by accident, something that explains why certain visualizations seem to work almost immediately, while others take weeks of repetition before producing any noticeable shift at all. He called it, informally, the familiarity gap, the distance between how foreign a particular outcome currently feels to your sense of identity and how familiar it needs to become before your behavior actually starts to shift around it. Here is what this means in practice. If you visualize an outcome that is only a small stretch beyond your current reality, something genuinely close to what you already believe is possible for yourself, the familiarity gap is small, and even a handful of vivid visualization sessions can produce a noticeable shift in confidence and behavior. But if you visualize an outcome that represents an enormous leap from your current sense of identity, something that feels almost like it belongs to a completely different category of person than who you currently believe yourself to be, the familiarity gap is large, and it requires substantially more repetition before the scene stops feeling foreign and starts feeling like a genuine possibility. Your mind is willing to move toward. This explains something that confuses and discourages a lot of people who try visualization for the first time on an extremely ambitious goal. They expect quick results because they have heard stories of people whose lives seem to transform almost overnight without realizing that in most of those stories, the visualized outcome was actually much closer to the person's existing sense of identity than it initially appeared from the outside, or that the visible transformation followed months of consistent, unglamorous repetition that nobody bothered mentioning in the retelling. Understanding the familiarity gap allows you to set realistic expectations from the very beginning. A modest, near-term goal might shift noticeably within 1 to 2 weeks of consistent nightly visualization. A genuinely enormous identity-level goal might require months of consistent practice before the internal sense of familiarity catches up enough to meaningfully influence behavior. Neither timeline means the technique has failed. They simply reflect the actual size of the gap being closed. Let's talk about a specific practice Silva taught for deliberately narrowing this familiarity gap faster, something he called bridging, and it is one of the most practically useful pieces of his entire teaching on visualization, yet one of the least discussed online. Rather than jumping directly from your current reality to the fully achieved distant outcome, which can feel so foreign that your mind resists engaging with it fully, you construct a series of intermediate scenes each one a believable, plausible step closer to the final outcome than the last. If your ultimate goal feels enormous and distant, you do not force yourself to visualize the final version of that achievement every single night from day one. You begin instead by visualizing a nearer, more believable milestone along the way, something your mind can actually accept as plausible without much internal resistance. Once that nearer scene starts to feel genuinely familiar, comfortable, almost expected, you shift your visualization slightly further along the path to the next believable milestone and repeat the same process. Gradually, one bridge at a time, your mind is walked toward the larger outcome rather than being asked to leap the entire distance in a single attempt. An attempt that Silva observed frequently produced so much internal resistance that people abandoned the entire practice within days. This bridging technique explains why some of the most dramatic transformations people report from visualization actually unfolded over many months, quietly, one small familiar step at a time, even though from the outside, looking only at the beginning and the end, the change appears sudden and dramatic. The person doing the visualizing experienced it very differently, as a series of increasingly familiar, increasingly believable steps, each one only slightly less comfortable than the one before it. Let's talk about a mistake that even people who understand all four ingredients we've covered so far often still make because it undoes almost everything else. Silva called it fighting the scene, and it happens when someone tries to visualize an outcome while simultaneously holding somewhere in the back of their mind a competing scene of failure or embarrassment, essentially running two contradictory movies at once without realizing it. This split attention weakens both scenes considerably because your mind cannot fully commit its resources to building vivid, convincing detail in two directions simultaneously. If you catch yourself visualizing success while a nagging, competing image of failure keeps intruding, Silva's guidance was not to fight that competing image directly, since fighting it tends to give it more attention rather than less. Instead, you gently acknowledge its presence without engaging with it, the way you might notice background noise without turning to investigate it, and calmly redirect your full attention back to the primary scene you are deliberately constructing. Over repeated practice, the competing image naturally loses strength, not because it was defeated through direct confrontation, but because it was consistently starved of the attention that was keeping it alive. Let's go back for a moment to something Silva noticed early on that reframed how he thought about visualization entirely, because it explains why some people seem to visualize almost effortlessly, while others describe it as feeling forced and artificial no matter how many times they try. He observed that most adults, by the time they reach their 20s or 30s, have quietly lost a skill they had in abundance as children: the ability to construct fully immersive, sensory-rich, imagined worlds without any self-consciousness at all. Watch a child playing alone in a backyard, narrating an entire adventure out loud, fully absorbed, genuinely reacting with real emotion to events that exist only in their imagination. That child is not performing visualization as a technique. They are simply doing, naturally and without effort, exactly what Silva spent years trying to teach adults to do deliberately. Somewhere along the way, most people learn to suppress this ability, told implicitly and explicitly that imagination is for children, that adults deal in facts, that daydreaming is a waste of time. Silva's method, in a sense, was really about carefully, deliberately reawakening a capacity that was never actually lost, only buried under years of being told it was not a serious use of the mind. This matters practically, because if your first few attempts at detailed visualization feel stiff, self-conscious, or artificial, that is not a sign you lack some special gift others have. It is a sign you are simply out of practice at something you were naturally skilled at decades ago. And like any skill that has gone unused for a long time, it returns with repetition rather than through sudden natural talent. Now, let's talk about a specific obstacle that trips up people who genuinely understand all four ingredients but still struggle to apply them consistently, something Silva address directly because he watched it happen constantly. He called it premature judgment, the habit of evaluating whether a visualization session was good enough while you were still in the middle of constructing it. Was that detailed enough? Did I really feel that emotion, or was I just imagining that I felt it? Am I doing this correctly? This constant self-monitoring pulls you directly out of the relaxed, immersive state the technique depends on and drags you back into the analytical, evaluating mode of mind that undermines the entire process. Silva's guidance here was simple and specific. Save the evaluation for afterward, if at all. While you are actually inside the visualization, your only task is to keep adding detail, keep gently returning your attention to the scene whenever it wanders, and let the process unfold without grading yourself in real time. A session does not need to be judged as good or bad while it is happening. It simply needs to be allowed to happen fully, without interruption, from your own internal critic standing just outside the scene with a clipboard. Let's talk about something else worth mentioning because it comes up constantly among people who are skeptical of visualization for reasons that are actually quite fair. Does this only work for people who are naturally good at picturing things vividly in their minds? And what about people who report having very little visual imagination at all, sometimes describing their inner mental world as almost entirely without pictures? This is a real and documented variation in how human minds work, and Silva's broader framework accounts for it better than most modern discussions of visualization do, mainly because his method was never purely visual in the first place. Remember the 4 ingredients. Multisensory detail explicitly includes sound, physical sensation, and even smell alongside sight, precisely because relying on visual imagery alone excludes a significant number of people who process imagined scenarios more strongly through other senses. If you are someone who struggles to conjure a clear mental picture but can easily imagine the sound of a particular voice, or the physical sensation of a specific posture, or the emotional tone of a remembered room, you are not excluded from this technique at all. You simply lean more heavily on the senses that are naturally strongest for you, building the scene primarily through sound and feeling rather than sight, while still including whatever visual elements you can access, even faintly. Silva worked with people across this entire spectrum of imaginative ability, and his consistent finding was that the specific sensory channel mattered far less than the underlying principle, building a rich, multisensory, emotionally engaged scene using whichever combination of senses came most naturally to that particular mind. Let's talk about a practical detail that surprises people once they start applying this consistently, something related to how the scene itself should evolve over time rather than staying frozen and identical every single night. Silva did not teach people to construct one perfect scene and then repeat it identically, word for word, detail for detail, every night indefinitely. He taught something more organic. The core outcome stays consistent, the specific thing you are working toward, but the details surrounding it are allowed, even encouraged, to shift slightly from night to night, incorporating whatever feels most alive and specific on that particular evening. One night the scene might emphasize the sound of a particular room more heavily. Another night it might emphasize a specific conversation in more detail. This gentle variation prevents the scene from becoming stale and mechanically repeated, which tends to happen when people treat visualization like reciting a memorized script rather than genuinely revisiting and rebuilding a living scene each time. A scene that stays genuinely alive, slightly different in its texture each night, while remaining consistent in its core outcome, tends to hold attention and produce emotional engagement far more reliably than an identical recording played back nightly without variation. Let's return to the 4th ingredient for a moment, because there is an important nuance about timing worth adding beyond simply doing this before sleep. Silva observed that the quality of the relaxation preceding the visualization mattered as much as the visualization itself, and that people often rushed this preparatory phase far more than they realized. A body that is still holding tension, a mind that is still partially engaged with the day's leftover stress, will produce a noticeably weaker visualization session than a body and mind that have genuinely been allowed to settle first. This is why the relaxation sequence, breathing slowly, releasing physical tension deliberately from head to feet, is not a separate, optional warm-up you can skip when short on time. It is an integral part of the actual mechanism, because a visualization built on top of unresolved tension carries that tension into the scene itself, subtly undermining the calm, receptive quality the technique depends on entirely. Now, let's talk about a question that comes up constantly from people who have tried this seriously for several weeks and want to know what happens next. Once the initial novelty of the practice has worn off and it becomes simply another part of the nightly routine, Silva observed that long-term practitioners of this technique often describe something subtle but important, a gradual shift from visualization feeling like a deliberate, effortful exercise toward it feeling more like a natural extension of how they already thought about their own future, almost without conscious effort. This does not mean the technique becomes unnecessary or should be abandoned once it feels effortless. It means the underlying skill has genuinely developed, the same way an experienced musician eventually plays scales without conscious thought that once required careful, deliberate attention. The nightly practice at that stage often becomes shorter, more efficient, requiring less deliberate construction because the mind has already built strong, familiar pathways toward constructing rich, detailed scenes quickly. There's one more layer worth adding here because it addresses something people frequently misunderstand about the relationship between visualization and actual decision-making in daily life. Some assume that once you have visualized an outcome enough times, you should simply wait passively for circumstances to align, as though the visualization itself is doing all the necessary work in the background. Silva was direct in correcting this misunderstanding wherever he encountered it. Visualization does not replace decisions. It changes which decisions feel natural to make. A person who has spent weeks vividly rehearsing a specific outcome tends to notice, almost automatically, when a real opportunity in their waking life resembles some piece of that rehearsed scene and tends to act on it with less hesitation than they would have shown before the visualization work began. The visualization is doing its job precisely at the moment a real choice appears, not by removing the need for that choice, but by making the confident version of that choice feel like the obvious, natural one to make. This distinction matters because it reframes what success actually looks like while you are in the middle of this practice. You are not waiting for a single dramatic moment when the visualized scene simply appears in your life unprompted. You are watching, in your ordinary daily decisions, for a growing tendency to choose the bolder option, the harder conversation, the application you would have previously talked yourself out of submitting, the introduction you would have previously been too nervous to make. These small, everyday choices, made slightly more boldly and slightly more consistently than before, are the actual visible evidence that the internal work is translating into something real. Let's also address a subtle trap that catches people who are otherwise doing everything correctly, something Silva referred to as scene hopping. This happens when someone, excited by the early results of visualizing one goal, starts adding new, unrelated goals into their nightly practice before the original scene has had enough time to become fully familiar. Each new addition dilutes the attention available for the others, and instead of one goal steadily becoming more familiar and less foreign to the mind, several goals remain permanently in an early, unfinished state, each one receiving too little consistent attention to ever cross the familiarity threshold that produces real behavioral change. Silva's guidance here echoes something we've touched on before, but deserves repeating specifically in the context of visualization. One core scene, developed with real depth and consistency over weeks, will typically produce far more noticeable results than 5 different scenes, each visited only occasionally and never developed with the same level of sensory and emotional detail. Now, let's bring all of this together into a single, complete sequence, the way you would actually apply it tonight, because understanding each individual ingredient only matters once you know how they fit together in practice. You begin by getting your body and mind into that relaxed, receptive state, lying down in the dark, breathing slowly, deliberately releasing tension from your body from head to feet, allowing yourself to grow heavier and quieter, the same preparation that makes any deep work with the mind before sleep more effective. Once you feel that familiar drowsy, settled sensation, you bring to mind the specific outcome you have chosen to work on, ideally one that represents a believable next step rather than an overwhelming leap, following the bridging principle we just discussed. You begin building the scene deliberately, starting with the visual layer, the specific setting, the specific time of day, the specific people present, seen clearly rather than as vague shapes. You then add sound, deliberately, the particular voice of someone speaking, the ambient noise of the environment, music if it fits the scene. You add physical sensation, the weight or texture of something in your hands, the temperature of the air, the position of your own body within the scene. You add specific dialogue, if people are present, imagining the actual words being exchanged in voices that genuinely sound like the real people involved. And then, rather than rushing past the emotional layer, you allow yourself to actually feel, even briefly and quietly, the specific emotion that would naturally accompany this moment if it were genuinely happening right now. You hold this fully constructed scene for a minute or two, resisting the urge to rush through it or move on too quickly, engaging with it the way you might revisit a vivid, meaningful memory rather than reciting a checklist. If a competing, doubtful thought intrudes, you acknowledge it briefly without engaging and gently return your attention to the scene. And then, without forcing anything further or analyzing what you have just done, you simply allow yourself to drift into sleep, letting the scene settle in undisturbed, ready to be revisited and refined again the following night. That is the complete technique built from the actual mechanics Silva identified through years of direct observation, rather than the flattened, oversimplified version that circulates casually online, stripped of almost every detail that actually makes it effective. Let's address something honestly, because it would be irresponsible to leave it out. None of this bypasses the actual work required to achieve a genuinely difficult goal. Visualization, done correctly, does not eliminate the need for real skill development, real effort, or real risk-taking in your waking life. What the evidence and decades of observation consistently point toward is something more precise and, in some ways, more useful than a shortcut. Properly constructed visualization appears to influence the parts of your brain responsible for confidence, familiarity, and behavioral readiness, meaning that when real opportunities related to your visualized goal actually appear in your waking life, you are measurably more likely to notice them, act on them decisively, and recover quickly if the first attempt does not succeed. The visualization is not replacing the climb. It is training the specific muscles you will need once you actually start climbing, so that when the moment to act arrives, hesitation and self-doubt have already been substantially worn down through repeated deliberate rehearsal. It is worth being equally honest about where the evidence is strong and where it is more limited. The broader psychological research on mental rehearsal, particularly in athletic and performance settings, is genuinely substantial, showing measurable benefits for skill retention, confidence, and reduced performance anxiety when imagery is practiced with the kind of detail and consistency we have described. Silva's own specific framework, developed through personal observation across many individual cases rather than large controlled trials, sits on somewhat different footing, useful and internally consistent, but not equivalent to a peer-reviewed clinical protocol. Holding both of these facts at once, that the underlying mechanisms are well supported while Silva's particular packaging of them was built more from careful observation than formal research, gives you an honest, grounded way to evaluate the technique rather than either dismissing it outright or treating it as an infallible formula. Let's talk about consistency one more time, because it remains, across every account Silva documented, the single largest predictor of whether visualization produces genuine results or simply becomes another abandoned self-improvement attempt. A single extraordinarily vivid session, no matter how well constructed, rarely produces lasting change on its own. What produces change is returning to the same core scene night after night, refining it slightly each time, allowing the familiarity to build gradually, the same way any skill deepens through consistent, repeated practice rather than a single intense burst of effort followed by nothing. People who saw genuine, lasting shifts in their confidence and behavior were never the ones searching for the single perfect visualization session. They were the ones who simply returned night after night to the same evolving scene, treating it less like a wish and more like a rehearsal for an outcome they were quietly, steadily walking toward. There is one final piece worth adding before we close, because it directly answers a question almost everyone eventually asks once they start practicing this consistently. How do you know if it is actually working, especially in the early weeks, before any dramatic external changes occurred? Silva pointed people toward a specific, reliable internal signal rather than waiting for external proof. Pay attention to how the scene itself feels to construct over time. In the beginning, a genuinely ambitious visualized outcome will often feel effortful to build, slightly foreign, occasionally accompanied by that familiar internal voice insisting this isn't realistic. As you continue practicing consistently, that same scene held in your mind on a later night will begin to feel different, easier to construct, more natural, accompanied by less internal resistance and quieter doubt. This shift, the scene becoming easier and more natural to hold in your mind over successive nights, is the earliest, most reliable sign that something genuine is happening internally well before any external evidence has had time to appear in your actual life. Waiting exclusively for external proof before trusting the process often means giving up during exactly the period when the real internal groundwork is quietly being laid. Tonight, when you lie down, you now understand something that separates visualization that genuinely reshapes behavior from visualization that simply passes a few pleasant minutes before sleep. You understand why sensory detail matters, why specific people and real dialogue matter, why genuine, unforced emotion matters, why timing matters, why bridging a large gap gradually matters, and why consistency, more than any single dramatic session, is what actually produces lasting change. You do not need to build a perfect scene on your very first attempt. You simply need to begin tonight applying even a few of these ingredients more deliberately than you ever have before, and let the rest deepen naturally with repetition. If this changed how you think about the minutes you spend imagining your future, imagine what else is waiting to be explored on this channel, because this is exactly what we do here, taking ideas that sound simple on the surface and showing you the precise mechanics hiding underneath them. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And tonight, when you close your eyes, stop picturing a flat, silent photograph of the life you want and start building it layer by layer the way a mind that is actually about to change would.